The Middle East refugee crisis has not yet hit, but it's on the way. Today, part two, we're going to be dealing with the instability, societal breakdown, and how will Europe and the West respond? So here we go. As we recall from the last webinar, we discussed the breakdown of infrastructure, in particular, water scarcity, that very few are looking at as a catalyst for a massive refugee catastrophe from the Middle East spreading to Western countries. There's also a debt crisis and massive military buildup. We're going to go over it briefly because there's a fair amount of information building the basis for what we want to understand in this webinar. The question comes up, how can the Middle East survive with all these breakdowns, especially issues of thirst and hunger? Because if there's little or no water, agriculture fails, and it is failing, as well as the population is still quite large in comparison to other populations around the world, and that people are still having more children than other cultures. So the possibility of tens of millions of refugees, and will they get any help? Who will step in and do something about it? When we take a look at the common denominators we have in the Middle East, the issues of Islam and Sharia law dominating. And many people say, oh, well, that's not really fair. Some people call it Islamophobia. But no, it's a way of thinking. It's a perspective on how the world works. And as we know, it's very difficult to find in Islamic democracy. Because what happens here? These are regimes that have religious law as the basic laws of their nations. And the military plays a very, very large role in ruling these societies. In other words, you have generals who become politicians straight on, and not only they take thinking with them, but the entire apparatus and framework of state is a military/Sharia way of conducting business. The regimes are top-heavy in these perspectives, and what happens is that logical deductive reasoning, in many cases, is shunted aside. If you have criticism from the civil service, so to speak, those people lose their jobs or are forced to flee. So there is no really dedicated, independent civil service that can say, wait a minute, okay, the politicians may have this great idea, but it's a failure, right? One of the examples that we often give is what happened with all those dams built in Iran, over 600, that ended up destroying agriculture, not helping it, because of the amount of evaporation in very, very hot climates, and that it put an end to the traditional way of irrigating fields, which was very, very careful not to waste water, all right? Very thrifty, known as the Qanat system. Plus, there's mismanagement and corruption, because who gets appointed to jobs? Those who are in the regime, close to the regime, and not necessarily, or in general, nobody who really has the best credentials. Okay. Often we hear that these countries, no, they really are democratic, and the example given is Pakistan. Look, having elections does not make a country democratic. You have to have those institutions of the state that lead one towards democracy. Because just an election, look, we know that a lot of these leaders get elected with 95% of the vote, if not more. Another issue, many of these countries are in debt, and they're very dependent on the Arab Gulf states, who themselves are in a lot of trouble at the moment because of the war with Iran, have suffered a lot of damages, meaning that their foreign debts will not have guarantors, which leads us to understand very clearly that you could have economic collapse on this at the same time as infrastructure crisis, in particular as we mentioned with water. Last and not least, there's a very big separation between the people and the regime. The regime is a group of, in general, autocrats coming out of the military. They have their own agenda, and the army, either present or those who have retired from the army, are the apparatus of state. We know that very clearly when it comes to Iran. Here we have Ahmed Vahidi, commander of the IRGC, and even Assisi, who's considered a moderate, right, the ruler of Egypt, but Egypt is a praetorian state, meaning that you go from the military into civilian life and own much of the state structure. We speak about Qatar, which was considered to be successful, but when we dig down a bit, okay, they don't have much of a military, but they do have leadership by Al Thani, the family that rules Qatar, and only 12% of those living in Qatar are actually Qatari citizens. You have all these foreign workers who have no rights. Okay, so it's in a different way. And plus, yes, there is Sharia law, and there can be exceptions, for Westerners who have very important functions, but everything's temporary. Okay, so we're looking at this, and yes, there are a lot of common denominators, but you have to dig down to find them and understand that we're not talking about democracies with a lot of critical thinking. Just to review: water, energy, agricultural infrastructure failure, right? And the countries that we have reviewed and will continue on today. So first of all, the Iran, the IRGC, clerical rule alongside of the military, although we have to admit the military has gotten the upper hand. They do follow the jihad playbook. We know this very clearly by the fact they're clashing with the Americans now. And what was the issue? Over tolls in the Strait of Hormuz after the MOU was signed, but they were being offered well over $300 billion. Okay, but that wasn't enough. Okay, the idea was you have to have absolute and total victory. They're the most extreme example if you want. And yes, we have all these other crises: water, agriculture, and electrical grid. And you would think, electrical grid, how could that be in a country with so much oil? Okay, population of 290 million, and there has been a restart of the Gulf conflict. We'll see where it goes. Afghanistan, the Taliban, harsh regime, the same type of crisis. Most are not even on the energy grid, and with a population of 45 million, and women heavily oppressed. And both countries mentioned here, we know by 2030, may not be almost any water left. Pakistan, said to be a democracy, but the military really runs the show there. Food insecurity, floods, droughts, back and forth. Nobody really takes care of the population. And yes, they have insurgencies on their borders. Okay, and they're the largest country, 260 million. Iraq, people talk about it, well, it's becoming more democratic. Not exactly. It's a very weak democracy. And what really does characterize that country is that the Turks, who we know have control over the water, the Tigris and Euphrates, and they've cut 40%, therefore forcing Iraq and Syria, we'll get to in a moment, to be their proxies. Syria already is. Iraq could be on the way. And the other issue in Iraq is those Shiite militias who are more loyal to Iran than they are to the Iraqi people. We'll see where that goes, right, depending on how the Gulf War plays out. Okay, also population of 48 million and lots of dependency, a bit over 50% on the Strait of Hormuz. It's true, they can export oil up north and through Turkey, which makes them even more dependent. Syria, total Turkish domination because of the Euphrates being cut and the war that continued for over a decade, and you did not have rehabilitation of land or the reservoirs being taken care of. There's a lot of soil degradation and a fair amount of food insecurity, meaning people aren't quite starving, but they definitely are hungry. With a population of 26 million and only 3 hours of electricity per household on average. Imagine that, only 3 hours. Yemen, we know there's their Houthi dictatorship there, and they are Iranian proxies. This is the most water scarce nation in the world. We spoke about it extensively in the last webinar. And 50% of the population, and it's possible that it's more, is nearing starvation or starving already. Something that you don't see in all those clips showing Houthi fighters, right, with their rifles, many of them outdated, screaming and shouting for the destruction of Israel and the Western world and whatever else. Population that they cannot sustain, over 40 million. And a day zero, also water we're speaking about, the year 2030, inside the capital where most people live, and basically no electricity. Very, very little, right? Only 10% have. Egypt, we mentioned before with Assisi, a large country, about 120 million, and they have, it's about 97% desert. Food insecurity is very high at around 50%, and they're suffering from that blockade by the Houthis down in the Bab el-Mandeb. In addition, the Aswan Dam was supposed to be helping them. Instead, the silt gets caught way down in southern, what's known as Upper Egypt, and you do not have the fields, right, or the lands along the Nile and the Delta are not being replenished with nutrients, making Egypt very dependent on importing fertilizers, many artificial, uh, based on certain oil products as well. So it's a big problem, and the Ethiopian dam project will just make things worse, right? There's erosion as a result, and it really has backfired. And last and not least, and actually one of the probably the worst, alongside of, let's say, Yemen, is the Sahel, or the Sahara region, and Sudan. These are military governments, totally failed states, live in grinding poverty, and it's not just Sharia law. You have many groups that are just like ISIS or associated with them, right? The Islamic State Caliphate, who brutalize the population. To this day, every day they face mass death and destruction, something that's barely reported. And I always say, because it's Africa, the liberal press thinks they're very liberal, but why won't they report on what goes on in Africa? I leave you to your own conclusions. Okay, so now moving on. By the year 2030, the crisis is highly intensified. Well, like we said, we're approaching this day zero, where no water, or you have to drill down so far into aquifers that becomes extremely difficult. And the dams dry out as well. So we're speaking here of the possibility of mass flight and starvation, thirst and death. Now, people may not end up fleeing, because where are they going to go? To another desert area? How far can you go without food and water? They may very well end up dying where they are. Societal breakdown, regions and clans. You could live in the same country, but the country doesn't mean anything. If your family, clan, extended family is not getting the food they need and the water, they will fight the clan next to them. They'll want to share it, and the clan next to them, of course, may not want to do that. So these battles over the most basic resources of water will bring about this collapse. Now, the collapse goes in several directions, or I should say two in particular. Either you will have this enormous extremism, such as this jihadism, like we see in the Sahel and Africa, where there really are no resources left. So those who end up ruling are by far the most extremist types, right? They end up in power, or they take power because the government has totally failed. Or what's called anomie in general society. Anomie is when a society it simply collapses, and several things can happen. Either there's not just civil war, but it's multi-front civil war, a free-for-all as we would call it, or people just lying back and dying, saying I cannot do anything. And you take your average refugee, which usually is a mom and some children. The men are off fighting or have been killed for whatever reason. Okay, and what are they going to do? It's just a matter of death. It's a horrible situation. Okay, and we have a picture on the left here of a starving child, as well as boats that arrived. There's pictures from 2015. We had the massive refugee crisis arriving in southern Europe, particularly Greece and Italy. So let's take a look at Europe itself. Okay, here we have a map, right, broken into Western, Central, Southern, Southeastern Europe, and Scandinavia. Eastern Europe, kind of out of the picture. And nowadays, Eastern Europe's a bit redefined as being those areas like Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, whereas we may remember, the older generation, of course, that Eastern Europe were those satellite countries of the Soviet Union. And another map, we know that many from Africa had found their way to the Italian island of Lampedusa, which is south of Sicily and east of Tunisia. So we have that on the map as well. And the arrows. Europe today is halting immigration, the Mediterranean access. Now, we're going to have here percentages to show where we're going, right? Percentages of Muslims will be in parentheses. Okay, so Greece has 1.5 to 6% Muslims in its population. And that's because about 4.5% are recent immigrants. And now they have decided to clamp down, putting a wall on the Turkish border. Anybody who overstays their visa can find themselves in jail. They're not taking in refugees from third-party countries that may be European, right? They're saying, oh, well, because they're already into Europe, the Schengen agreement, and well, they should be absorbed. They said, no. We'll be getting to that, what the Europeans just did last month, to do it as a block, okay? And anybody who is not documented gets deported. They have no way of vetting these people. So it's a very tough situation. Italy suffered from overwhelming amount of refugees showing up at Lampedusa, they now are processing in Albania, third country processing. And that is becoming, quote, all the rage. There are some countries that are going to say they're going to start doing it also in Africa and pay those countries to hold these migrants. Okay. They've also decided, and this was a European policy that has been discussed over the years, to give money to the North African countries to halt African immigration on the high seas. So they have allocated 800 million euros, not a small amount. And all those charitable organizations that are involved in rescue frameworks, they will find themselves with fines levied by the Italian government. As they're saying, you're encouraging people by rescuing them. Now, you can imagine where this flies in the face of being humanitarian, right? You really want people to drown at sea. And what the Italians are saying is, look, if you don't want them to drown at sea, don't encourage them. Okay, but we know their situation is horrendous in Africa and certainly in North Africa, where we know that Black Africans times have suffered horribly at the hands of the regimes there. And last and certainly not least, in discussing the Mediterranean area, you have France, which is really considered more of Central Europe. Okay, and they have a different situation because 10% of the population is Muslim, and they have a far, far left as well as a red-green axis. Their agitation is to have more of these migrants, right? Because it does embolden and augment their power in the French political framework should the migrants get citizenship. But the French, in any case, have begun to deport illegal migrants. So France has a problem, especially around Paris, but other cities as well. Nice in the south, right, where there are no-go zones, where you have migrants and Muslim immigrants that have taken over. The police don't even go into these areas. They have decided that they still have labor shortages, so people with special skills can apply to stay. And then they hope, of course, to get citizenship, but you have to be able to be part of that aspect of the economy. Let's take a look at Central Europe, in particular when we speak about Germany. Okay, we have a picture here of Angela Merkel and Friedrich Merz. Merkel was the chancellor some 10 years ago, had that open door policy, and Merz, who's chancellor today, and has closed the door. So we'll take a look. 6.7% of Germans are of Muslim background, and the policy, as I just mentioned, reversed. Merkel had open doors. She believed that Germany and Europe could absorb millions of immigrants if they were strong enough. And I don't think one could fault her for having bad intentions. It's just that it did not work out very well. That doctrine would be canceled recently. And the whole Schengen arrangement, where European states, if you came to one, so you weren't to be checked at the border of another, is now being reversed. In other words, each country, and Germany is doing it as well as others, saying, no, we have the right to check whoever comes across our border, even if you came in through a neighboring country that we're in agreement with as part of the European Union. They also decided to deport with flights back to two countries in particular, where most of the refugees had come previously, okay, from 10 years ago, back to Afghanistan and Syria, when they're deemed, okay, it's safe now. And by the way, it certainly has happened with Syria. They say, there's a new regime, there's law and order, and there is. It's not exactly the law we'd all like to live by. No, you're back. You're leaving. Similar with Afghanistan, which is also settled down, but you wouldn't want to live there, as we know. Austria, 8.3% Muslims, following the footsteps of others, spending those immediate influx, saying we can check the borders, and more refugee quotas and the deportations, like the others. Everybody's going to deportations now. We'll get to where it doesn't quite work, okay? Because everybody, we speak about, okay, so that's going to work. Not necessarily. The Netherlands decided that where they used to make asylum for quite a while, now it's up to 3 years, and the process is through. You either get in or you don't, and they're cutting back, and quite a few migrants are being deported. Belgium, which is surprisingly, I thought it was a lot higher, only 6% of the population is Muslim. However, in the Brussels region and in the capital, it's 40 to 50%. In other words, very much concentrated there. Therefore, when people go to Brussels, they really feel that this is not a Christian country, or it's half-half if you want. And the way they did it was technically by cutting back on social benefits. You don't get anything. You have to work for 5 years. You're on your own. And then, if you behave the way you should, you can apply for asylum, but it's a long process. And like everything else, deportations if you are illegal. So Merz and others, right, this whole policy that Merkel had has been reversed. Now let's go to the two extremes. Eastern Europe versus Britain, the comparison. And right, there are two sort of ends of the of Europe, if you want, if we don't include Russia and Eastern Europe. So when we speak of Eastern Europe, and I wrote it as such, Eastern Europe, because it's traditionally Eastern Europe, we speak about Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and so forth. There are virtually no Muslims were allowed in. In other words, they didn't have a problem with other communities, people showing up, but they decided they did not want that immigration a decade or so ago. And they said, we don't want to clash with Christian Europe. We are a Christian nation, and that's the way we want to keep it. So Hungary, which has only 0.2% Muslims, they refused the entries in 2015. They were punished by the EU, had to pay fines, or didn't have monies coming to them that should have. And they said, okay, we'll leave it that way because we don't want to suffer the consequences. Similar, but not as bad, if you put that in quotes, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, they have either less than 1% to 2% of overall Muslim populations. Great Britain, which is under 10% at 7%, however, Muslims are very prominent there. And we know that there's been the red-green axis, which has come alive in all those demonstrations, certainly for Palestinians against Israel, but many of them very anti-British. And we've seen that play out in the streets and counter demonstrations, people waving the old Union Jack, question of whose side the police are on, right? So there's a lot of social disruption. And we need to point out that London is 15% Muslim, many of them are obviously recent immigrants, and that the mayor himself is Muslim, has been elected 3 times, meaning that in London, the majority, Christians, right, or British, voted for Sadiq Khan, who we see on the left-hand side. So there is a bit of a disconnect. If people say, well, wait a minute, isn't everybody against, right, this immigration? The answer is no. The society itself is split. You also have in Brighton and Hove and Birmingham that also have Muslim mayors and quite a few Muslims on city councils nationwide. There are a lot of issues here dealing with law codes and clash, Sharia law, as in personal law, or does it override British common law? And apparently some places it has. The great scandal that arose recently, it was always there, but it was ignored or shunted aside, where thousands of girls were abused in these grooming gang scandals, and it said that it could be up to 250,000 altogether. So it's led to a hardline right wing, known as Reform movement, led by Nigel Farage, that is challenging the previous policy, and so much so that the average person in Britain is demanding that there has to be limitations and this stopped. And even the Labour government is working on reforms to curb immigration that apparently will include much more vetting. Where do they prefer people to be allowed in? No, those with more of an education, that they fit into the workforce, and if they're studying at British universities. So here we have a picture on the right of Viktor Orban of Hungary, who was voted out recently, very hardline right wing. There's a lot of criticism of in Hungary and outside, but it turns out that Europe is now adopting his policies. As much as one could disagree on many issues, on this one, many are saying, you know what, in essence, he was correct. The map of Britain, where it shows where there were disorders and protests, right, just recently. So before we go on, we hope that you're enjoying the facts and analysis. And if you're watching us on YouTube, put in a commentary and share, give us a like, and sign up for the Ne'eman Academy. You have access to all our materials. Scandinavia, we're speaking of skills and integration. Now we know the Scandinavians have been very open, especially when we speak of Sweden. So first we're going to go to Denmark. They were the first ones to clamp down recently. The Prime Minister, Frederiksson, she's from the Labour, Social Democrats, right? The Labourites, if you want. And she decided they were halting immigration. The right wing was gaining quite a bit of sympathy because of the immigration issue, and she simply adopted it and said, you know what? Yes, Denmark is being overrun culturally. And there were a lot of issues there also about like people not following the rules of trust. This goes on in all of Scandinavia. Scandinavian society is very much based on trusting the government, trusting your officials, and trusting that nobody cheats. They were the first ones to say basically zero asylum, border crossings. Maybe there were a few hundred that got in last year. All right. The borders are essentially locked shut. And when the home country will be deemed safe, people will go back. And it's not a matter of you're in Denmark for a certain amount of time you can stay. Very difficult to get citizenship. Sweden was known to be very liberal, so much so that one could not mention, right, that if someone committed a crime, what their ethnic religious background was. Even those who the crime was committed against them, they couldn't even share it with anyone else. And we know of women who suffered sexual abuse, and their perpetrator would get half a year or a year in jail, and they would mention that person's background, and they got even more time in jail or fined or whatever else. Okay, so what has happened is there's been a shift in policy all the way. One wouldn't say so, but there's now a demand for high skills, as well as there's in all the Scandinavian countries behavior regulations. You can't have any infractions. You have to be a model guest in that country. Sweden suffered a lot of crime from having this open immigration policy, and now they are saying you need at least 8 years of residency, and you have to pass all sorts of exams to prove that you really want to be part of Sweden. And what they're offering is $35,000 for anybody who wants to be repatriated back to their home country. Okay, it's quite possible to go to another country, but that's what they're doing. Finland, with a small amount of migrants, they're very tough on screening and demand high skills. So almost nobody can meet those standards. And also suspending the asylum, and anybody who comes is very quick to decide whether they can stay or not. And of course, that leads to very few actually remaining and less applications. Norway, same thing. They do allow for very easy family reunification, and therefore I believe they will be the one country that people will flow to, because they'll say I'm related to so and so, right? Now, whether they'll give them DNA testing, who knows? Okay, but extended families for sure. And anybody who's illegal, you're detained, and of course, yes, deportations for misbehavior. Okay, so there is a change here, and a big one. So let's go to the European Parliament. They tie this all together. In June, last month, that's it, 2026, they started what was known as the European Return Order. And it was a policy obligating everyone. Why? Because with the Schengen rules, you could get into one country, and maybe another country had strict rules for entering, but no, that wasn't going to be acceptable anymore. They all have to follow the same playbook. And the decisions, instead of taking, months and years or whatever else, very quick, within a few weeks. And this whole idea of third countries, that you could go and apply for asylum there, not in the European countries themselves. They're actually speaking of Africa, as mentioned before. There are issues about the entry ban. If you were thought to be a security threat, which I found very strange, they said, well, you could be banned for 10 years, if not more. Well, why not ban them for life if that's what you thought, whether people are going to change that much? But that may be a certain mindset that they could change. So the idea is that people should be not allowed in or deported. So this whole processing, right? You always say you can decide whatever you want. If you don't allocate money, it doesn't mean anything. 3 billion euros, that's a fair amount, has been allocated, but, and that's the last line here, enforcement is weak. When people are told that they no longer can stay and they're notified they have to leave within a short amount of time, they suddenly disappear, 75%, and they don't have enough policing force to catch everybody. In Denmark, by the way, you are obligated to report if somebody is illegal. Okay, you're responsible, and that is what may happen elsewhere as well. And of course, there is the Israel angle, something that we always discuss here. Jordan, Egypt, and Israel. So, from the Middle East, if you're trying to cross the border into Turkey, it may not work that well. From Iraq, it could be, but certainly the border with Iran is being closed. We can imagine from Iraq, from Syria, one way or another, people could flee into Jordan, because Jordan, after all, has the backing of the West. It's the second most water scarce nation in the world, right behind Yemen, with a population that is 10% larger than Israel's, at 11.5 million. Right? The question is, how could they absorb more refugees? And Jordan's population is essentially made up of refugees. As we know, they're trying to build a desalination project from the Gulf of Aqaba and pump all that water northwards. Whatever they do, it won't be enough by the year 2030, and that also is their breaking point. So the possibility of instability and an explosion of sorts, led by the Muslim Brotherhood or just by different clans and political interests, will the state fray? If it does, Israel has its longest border, right? We're speaking of some 400 kilometers of border with Jordan that could suddenly become very, very unstable. And people attempting to cross into Israel, which does have water. And of course, that would mean migrants from Syria and Iraq making their way into Jordan. But who knows, other countries as well. As for Africa, last time, 2015-16, you had people who showed up on Israel's Negev border, not far from Gaza, just south of southern Gaza. And they had crossed Sinai. They came through Egypt and they were treated very poorly. They paid whatever money they had. They did whatever they had to do and crossed Sinai, often having help from Bedouin tribes, and then came to the border and demanded to be let in. And it was a real dilemma. What do you let people just die of hunger and thirst at the border? Many were let in, and later on, Israel did its best to help, but then also to repatriate them elsewhere, giving them money and whatever else. If you go to South Tel Aviv, you can see some of the migrants are still here. So how is Israel going to respond in the future? Repulse the migrants? And okay, both borders. And Israel, as we know, has a very, very serious man/woman power issue on its borders. Much of the border with Jordan is actually guarded by female light infantry units who also don't have enough, call it woman power. It's a matter of eyes, ears, and patrols. We're not talking about fighting a war. We're talking here about border security. So you look at these consequences, it is a catastrophe, a moral, ethical, and especially existential issue. And then finally, are there any solutions? So you extend aid. Well, these populations, many of them have extremist elements. Their suffering doesn't go away. It can be increased. The population increases. How much water, how much food, how much housing, when you're talking about not thousands or tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of refugees, but millions, and giving humanitarian aid. I'll be very cynical. Are you multiplying the suffering? You want people to suffer, but you just drag them along on the minimal amount of food and water, and even that you're not able to supply because simply the whole system worldwide is overwhelmed. If you think about the countries we spoke about, right, we put them all together, you get over 600 million people. Not that all of them will be in distress, but take a few tens of millions. Okay, and immigration to Europe locked out for the most part. So there'll be a few tens of thousands, maybe a few hundreds of thousands spread throughout Europe. Very different than what we had previously. And the EU does not want to collapse. They're very draining on those societies, not only economically, but socially. Possible uprisings, right? Remember, these people who are desperate, they will be put down harshly by Middle Eastern dictatorships. That gap between the leadership and the people is there, right? And it doesn't really matter who they kill. And it's been made very clear by the Houthis as well as the Iranians. Or the Iranians, we saw it in January. They will kill whoever, and it doesn't matter for what the reasons. They'll slaughter them. They can all die as long as the power elite and their supporters remain the leadership. And that could be having support of, 10, 20, 30%. That's it. And the West, if they do nothing, the disaster will take its course. And if they do something, most likely it'll just take its course, but on a lot slower pace. So, is there a solution? And I had an argument with AI. You should know that. I basically kept saying, well, there doesn't seem to be a solution on none. They kept speaking AI, came back at me. There's desalination projects, but how fast and how much money can be poured into it to make it work? Because there's a time gap, a time lag. That takes years to build these operations, and you also have to have, a shoreline. Afghanistan doesn't have one, for instance. Okay, and neither do the Sahel countries, right? The Sahara region. So there is a possibility, but even with that, it's just playing catch up all the time. It said if Jordanians do what they say, their whole project, which is enormous, by the year 2030, they've maybe solved half the problem. Maybe. Okay. And as far as Jordan's concerned, there's a whole deal of getting water from Israel, but Israel can't, give as much as they really need, and it's just a partial stopgap measure. They need reforms internally. There's going to be tremendous fallout from this. The question will be if could be restabilized, but not under these types of regimes. Hence, I come to a bottom line, which is not very happy, of a sad realism. There's no real solution. Quite possibly, tens of millions will die. Okay, and here we have a picture of parched earth, even after it rained. On the left-hand side, and the right, those demonstrations by the anti-Iranian regime opposition in the West. These regimes wrecked their own countries. And that's what happens when you have this sort of mindset. So thank you, and we will be taking your questions. First, as we always have, the credits. And just to go over our schedule. All right, today's the 19th, July 26th. Next Sunday, we're free. August 2nd, student Q&A. The 9th, we're free. August 16th, we will have a webinar open to everybody. So the 23rd is student Q&A, and August 30th, we're free. Become a sponsor, support our independent source-based education. Very important. Help us along. It takes a lot of time, energy, and research to make sure that people are informed by using the facts. And of course, and our courses, anti-Semitism from Pharaoh to Facebook, and our other course, exposing Islamic jihad and safeguarding humanity. You could certainly make a difference in all this and learn about it. So we urge people to learn more and be informed. Thank you very much from the Ne'eman Academy.